right. As we are waiting for other people to join us, we're just going to do a little bit of announcements and then we'll get started with our program. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jenny Berry. I'm the president of the Libertyville Historical Society, as well as the local history librarian here at the Cook Memorial Library. I'm very excited to have Laurie Stein with me today. Laurie is the assistant director and head of curation at the History Center of Lake Forest, Lake Bluff. And she also serves on our Libertyville Historical Society board. So we have another connection there. Multiple Libertyville Lake Forest connections today. Yeah, perfect. Okay. All right, I'm going to go ahead and turn off our camera because you don't need to see us staring at you. So the first time I remember finding a Libertyville Lake Forest connection is when I was preparing a presentation on the first women to vote in Illinois. On July 6, 1913, the Chicago Tribune reported on Libertyville's July 5th election. This was the first election held after the passing of the Illinois suffrage bill, which granted women the right to vote in elections for president, other offices not governed by the state constitution, and local option elections or referendums. The article said, "A crowd of girls came running breathlessly into the voting place. They had just heard that women were voting and they all decided to try the novelty. I'm afraid you won't be able to show you are 21, said Mayor Schnabel to Miss Marie O'Connor. We certainly are not 21, but we are 18 and of age, replied the young woman with a haughty stare and a stamp of her foot. Along with Marie O'Connor was an 18-year-old Lemoyne Stafford. All right, Miss Stafford was the daughter of pickle manufacturer Richard W. Stafford and his wife, Marcia Evans Stafford. According to the 1897 Libertyville Illustrated, Richard Stafford was the largest individual pickle dealer in the U.S. at the time. The main Stafford factory, as well as the family's primary residence, was in Chicago. But sometime in the 1890s, Stafford established a small factory in Libertyville at the corner of Church Street and 2nd Avenue. The family also had a house on the northeast corner of Milwaukee Avenue and Park Avenue, about where Berkshire Hathaway Real Estate is today, or as some of you might remember, where Joe's Fireside was. Miss Stafford was one of 10 kids and attended the local schools before the family moved to Area, now Mundelein, in 1914. In 1915, at the age of 20, Lemoyne married Gordon Kelly of Lake Forest at St. Lourdes Church, where she was a member of the choir. And now our story moves to the east.
All right, so Lemoyne's husband, Gordon Kelly, was in the second generation of a Scottish family who settled in Lake Forest around 1880. You can see him pictured here in the 1930s with his parents and 6 siblings, all of whom were living within a block or so of each other near Washington Circle in Lake Forest. Gordon's father, Alexander Kelly, had built up a paving contracting business that by 1923 had actually paved over half of Lake Forest streets and driveways. Gordon Kelly himself established a complementary side business, which installed metal curbing on all the private drives in town. Lemoyne and Gordon had 2 children, Gordon L. Kelly and Stafford W. Kelly, who grew up in Lake Forest and later both went on to serve in World War II. Gordon L. even was a bomber pilot who survived the attack on Pearl Harbor. Lemoyne Kelly worked as an assistant manager of Garnett's, which was a longtime department store in Market Square in Lake Forest, as well as Highland Park. She, like the rest of the Kelly family, was a member of the First Presbyterian Church of Lake Forest, and her husband had even been among the first group of babies baptized in the new church building, which is the current one, back in 1887. So around the time of the 100th anniversary of women voting in Illinois back in 2013, we realized that Lemoyne Stafford Kelly had another significant historical role. So this Libertyville suffragette was actually one of the founding members of the organization where I work, which was then called the Lake Forest Lake Bluff Historical Society, way back in 1972. So here you can see her circled in a group of Historical Society founders at the organizational meeting. So after finding this one connection, Jenny and I figured there had to be others and set out to find some more. So it's just under 9 miles between the two downtowns, and today it's a short drive that crosses over an interstate and takes about 15 to 20 minutes. I personally do it several times a week when I commute from Libertyville to my job in Lake Forest. But though many decades ago, it actually took 3 times as long to get from one town to the other via a horse and buggy traveling about 5 to 8 miles per hour, the connections between the two towns may have been even stronger earlier in our history.
To set the stage, a brief history of each town could be useful. Indigenous peoples have called this region home for 12,000 years or more. The opening of the Erie Canal in 1825, connecting the Great Lakes with New York via the Hudson River, encouraged westward migration of non-native settlers to northeastern Illinois. Pressure to open settlement resulted in a series of treaties to remove the indigenous peoples from their ancient homeland. The final treaty, the Treaty of Chicago, was signed in 1833 between the U.S. government and the United Nation of Chippewa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi Indians. Anticipating the opening of the land by the U.S. government, the first Euro-American in the Libertyville area, George Varden, arrived in the mid-1830s. As the land became officially available for sale, more people came, and by 1850, when township government was established, Libertyville had around 400 residents. In 1880, the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad built an extension across the Des Plaines River into Libertyville from what is now Rondout. A residential and commercial building boom followed, and the village of Libertyville incorporated in April 1882. In 1903, the Chicago and Milwaukee Electric Railroad constructed a spur from Lake Bluff to Libertyville on the south side of the village, now the North Shore Bike Trail, which gave easier access to and from Chicago and attracted newcomers. The population doubled in the 10 years between 1900 and 1910, reaching 1,700 people by the end of that decade.
To the east of Libertyville, by the 1840s and 1850s, a number of homesteads had cropped up in the grasslands in what would become West Lake Forest. Like in Libertyville, which grew along the Des Plaines River and the Milwaukee Trail, this settlement was along the Skokie River and what would become Waukegan Road. Many of these first pioneers were Irish immigrants. Their farming community, known by the 1880s as Everett, shared an adjacent and overlapping history with Lake Forest until it was annexed in 1926. So Lake Forest itself was founded in 1861 by a group of Chicago Presbyterians who hoped to build a community with homes, a church, and a Presbyterian church, of course, and institutions of higher learning close to but removed from Chicago, a refuge beyond the city's surging population and the daily trials of urban life, in an atmosphere conducive to educating their youth. So they selected a site of about 1,200 acres, 30 miles north of Chicago, along the new Chicago and Northwestern train line, which had been constructed through the area in 1855. A stock company, the Lake Forest Association, was organized to offer lots to investors in proportion to the shares they held, with funds from the sale of half of those lots going toward the development of the planned university. This became Lake Forest College. Lake Forest was the first large-scale garden suburb to be designed and executed anywhere in the United States. The plan for Lake Forest integrated the town into the terrain, with the area's natural features of lake, ravines, bluffs, and groves guiding the street plan, seen in this map here. This meant that in place of traditional city blocks, the curvilinear roadways came together to create the uniquely shaped lots, as you can see. And that brings us up to the time when most of the people we'll talk about tonight had arrived in the area. So the types of people who have connections to both towns really runs the gamut. Over the course of this presentation, we'll talk about a couple of landowners, as well as people who worked on the estates, local architects, and business people. So our first two profiles are of men who could be considered gentlemen farmers or hobby farmers. In the late 1800s, this development of wealthy Chicagoans building summer residences or estate farms in rural areas and suburbs surrounding the city was tremendously impactful for both the development of Libertyville and of Lake Forest. Both communities, though founded under different contexts, gained the reputation as locales for large estates. Each was within a convenient distance from the city by train and by the increasingly ubiquitous automobile. This gentleman farm movement was part of a larger cultural shift, reevaluating the benefits of country life. The rapid rise in urban density and the effects of the Industrial Revolution created a sense that the cities were unhealthful and stifling. In response, arose a desire for space and fresher air away from the urban centers. The gentleman farms were generally not intended as profit making ventures. Gentlemen farmers had another career or source of income and transferred their business acumen to their farming operations, seeking higher yields, planting experimental crops, competing for livestock trophies, and streamlining dairy operations. Large sums of money could be put into importing purebreds, raising exotic animals, and testing new techniques and farm machinery. An impressive manor house was often a key component, like the one pictured here in Lake Forest, built for Lewis F. Swift. Famed landscape designers were brought in to develop unified estate plans and create elaborate gardens.
Until the early 1900s, outside the Libertyville village limits was mostly a patchwork of family farms. Working the land was the main occupation of the majority of property owners. Real estate ads for Libertyville properties in the first decade of the 20th century actively recruited those looking for the gentleman farmer life. The railroad had come to Libertyville in 1880 and the electric railroad in 1903, making it a bit easier to get this far out. Some ads made sure to use that as a selling point. One ad said the railroad made it an easy matter for anyone so desiring to live on this farm and do business in Chicago. They were looking for those with farm fever and those wanting a summer home or a country estate. It's very possible the man I'm about to introduce you to saw these or similar advertisements, made the trek to Libertyville, and decided this was the place for him to take care of his farm fever. Meet John R. Thompson. Born November 1865 on a farm outside of Fithian, Illinois, which is along I-74 between Champaign and Danville, Thompson attended college and then bought the local general store with his older brother. He married Rose Holloway in 1891. In 1892, a cousin living in Chicago encouraged Thompson to come north and seek a job at the company he worked at. Thompson sold his share of the local store to his brother and moved to Chicago, but the job didn't work out. Lore has it that he set out down State Street to search out other opportunities. He came across a small restaurant named Thompson's, which may have been fate, and went in for a cup of coffee. He told the proprietor it was the worst cup of coffee he had had in his life, and he could make a better cup himself. The owner challenged him to buy the place and make that cup of coffee, and he did. Traffic at the restaurant increased with the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, but dropped a little afterwards. But business recovered, and Thompson was able to open another 2 restaurants within 3 years. The restaurant shown here was next door to the Iroquois Theater on Randolph Street between State Street and Dearborn. Thompson expanded to other cities and at one point was the largest chain of restaurants in the country. By the end of World War I, there were over 100 restaurants in 43 cities, and he would later also run a group of 70 groceries. Outside of business, Thompson's passion was horses, and especially racing trotting horses. In 1902, Thompson purchased a large tract of land south of downtown Libertyville from the Stratton family, who had owned the land since 1843. Architect Benjamin Marshall designed the impressive Colonial Revival house a few years later, which you see here. In 1909, Thompson added a sunken garden with a lily pond, and the local paper ran a column about the improvements that said, "The Thompson farm is one of the prettiest spots near Libertyville. The buildings and fences are all white and located on high ground, and it can be seen for miles around. The view from top of the knoll at the farm presents an expanse of broad acres, which is the finest farming land to be found in northern Illinois." The approximately 300-acre farm in Libertyville became known for its show and thoroughbred horses and ran a successful stud service for trotting horses. They also had cows, chickens, turkeys, peacocks, a fruit orchard, vegetable garden, and a greenhouse. Thompson's love of horses extended past his own farm. He was a founding member and president of the Libertyville Trotting Association, which operated the 1-mile track near the current intersection of Crane, Carter, and Rockland Roads. Thompson became ill in the winter of 1921-22 and was diagnosed with heart problems. His daughter and her husband bought a house in Lake Forest in the summer of 1922, and they took John to look at the place, and he became interested in nearby properties and decided to sell his Libertyville home. Samuel Insull purchased the Libertyville farm in 1923 as a wedding present for his son, Samuel Insull Jr. It is during this time that the farm became known as Red Top Farm due to the special fireproofing material Samuel Insull Jr. used on the roofs of the barns. Now, Laurie will tell you a little bit about Thompson's Lake Forest property.
Thompson's new Lake Forest estate was located on the east side of Green Bay Road, near the border with Lake Bluff, which he purchased for $350,000, or about $6.6 million today. You can see his town-to-town move on the map here. Thompson's new estate was known as West Highlands for its location 113 feet above lake level at Lake Forest's highest point. Green Bay Road ran along a glacial ridge. The property featured a landscape by famous architect Jens Jensen, including formal Italian terraces, cut flower gardens, and greenhouses alongside woodlands. The caption for this aerial photo, which you can just see faintly along the bottom, was printed in a Chicago newspaper, reads, quote, "Why go to Europe to see wonderful estates? Right outside Chicago, we have some of the fairest houses dropped into fairyland spots. Doesn't this airplane photo of the John R. Thompson estate in Lake Forest look like a little kingdom to which the conquering knight takes his fair lady in the storybooks?" So the 32-room residence had originally been built in 1912 for the Moore family. It had been designed in the Italianate style by estate architect Arthur Hoyne. Upon taking ownership, Thompson had it redecorated and had a passenger elevator installed. This photo shows one of Thompson's granddaughters, Ruth Owen, on a pony at his stables with a member of the estate staff. Thompson remodeled and built new stables for his renowned thoroughbreds, show horses and riding champions who had won prizes all over the country. These photos are from the collection of Gunnar Swalgren, a Swedish immigrant who worked as part of Thompson's house staff as a young man. Here you can see the swimming pool, which was large enough to feature a bridge across the middle. Thompson died in 1927 at age 62. In 1939, his widow worked with landscape architect Ralph Millman to subdivide much of the property into 3-acre lots. In the early 1960s, the Bath and Tennis Club, pictured on the right, was built on a portion of his former property. This former estate house, which is on the left, was demolished in 1969. So while Thompson made the move from Libertyville to Lake Forest, our next landowner went the opposite direction. Arthur Lincoln Farwell was a member of the second generation of one of the founding families of Lake Forest. Arthur's father, John V. Farwell, and his family had been pioneering settlers from New York in the 1830s. Their first home in western Illinois was a log cabin of 14 square feet. According to family memoirs, the boys of the family built a new house, not only making their own brick and cutting their own stone, but also creating the wagon used to carry the materials. As young men, John and his brother Charles Farwell both came to Chicago in the 1840s with little but their wits and a handful of coins in their pockets. Their first employment was in the city clerk's office, where Charles excelled. He went on to be a leader in Chicago's new Republican Party and ultimately a U.S. Senator. John, however, was too earnest and direct for politics and began instead to climb the ladder in the dry goods business. Within a decade, he was at the helm of Chicago's principal wholesale dry goods firm, J.V. Farwell and Company, which came to national prominence as a major supplier of uniforms to the Union Army in the Civil War. By the 1880s, it was one of the top 3 wholesalers in the country. As staunch Presbyterians and firm proponents of education, the Farwell brothers saw much to admire in the venture to establish a community, church, and college in Lake Forest, and became initial investors in the Lake Forest Association, acquiring large plots of land across the street from each other on Deer Path. John V. Farwell's Lake Forest home, built in 1869, was the first American country house to be built largely with Portland cement. You can see it here. It still stands in Lake Forest to this day, though with some alterations and without the central tower. John V. Farwell had 5 children. His youngest son, Arthur Lincoln Farwell, grew up spending summers at the house in Lake Forest and in 1884 graduated from Yale, where he played football with Walter Camp. He spent his career with J.V. Farwell and Company, becoming vice chairman. Now, if you're interested in the Farwell family, the History Center in Lake Forest is actually hosting a program this Thursday in honor of John V. Farwell's 200th birthday. So there's a talk about J.V. Farwell and the impact that the family's had on Lake Forest. So if you're interested in more of this Farwell stuff, please go to our website, the History Center website, and you can register for that. But just a little bit more Farwell stuff here. So in 1900, Arthur Farwell, John V's son, became the talk of Lake Forest as the first resident to bring one of those newfangled contraptions, the automobile, to town. His black Winton caused much consternation in the community. At first an exciting novelty, it soon begat a groundswell of opposition. As locals complained about its excessive noise, it apparently emitted the, quote, deafening sounds of a threshing machine, as well as the fear it inspired in horses and pedestrians alike. Which led to several carriage crashes and overturnings. As a result, the mayor and city council sent the pictured letter here to Arthur Farwell, requesting that the undersigned, believing that the operation of an automobile upon the narrow and winding streets of our city endangers the lives and property of many, would be especially thankful if you would cause the machine to be withdrawn from the city, which he did not do. The city council then passed an ordinance, which, while not quite outright banning the automobile, put significant restrictions on its use, including that it could not be operated in a manner dangerous to horses, it could not be left standing, it could not exceed 5 miles per hour, with a violation of $5 for each violation, so nearly $200 today. Perhaps the most encumbering provision was that no machine, quote, shall be operated unless someone shall precede it on foot a distance of 300 feet ahead and warn all people of the approach of such vehicles so as to avoid accidents. So for the rest of the summer, Farwell had to recruit a flagger to run ahead every time he drove his Winton. Over the next few years, as automobiles became more popular, the ordinance, of course, quickly grew obsolete.
A few decades after disturbing the peaceful streets of Lake Forest, in the early 1920s, Arthur Farwell made the move north and west, purchasing the Taylor family farm along Milwaukee Avenue at Belvedere Road, today's 120. Farwell kept a house in Lake Forest and later a home in Chicago, so Spinney Run served as a getaway and summer home. Now, we're taking a little liberty considering this farm to be in Libertyville. It's not even in Libertyville Township, but the dairy gave its location as Libertyville in its advertising for many years, so we felt it was worth including. Upon taking over the farm, Farwell sold off the existing Holstein cows in order to bring in a herd of Ayrshires. Spinney Run Farm became known for its purebred cows and won several breeding prizes over the years. So we don't generally have livestock pictures in our historical presentations, but I wanted to know the difference between the Holstein and the Ayrshire. So here you go, just in case you're interested as I was. According to the American Dairy Association, the Holsteins are the superstars of milk production, known for producing the highest quantity of milk compared to other breeds, kind of your standard Wisconsin-looking cow. And Ayrshire cows hail from Scotland. They're hardy cows that can produce high-quality milk with a moderate fat content. And they're known for their ability to adapt to a wide range of farming conditions. So now you know. So Arthur's wife, Catherine Farwell, raised her own prize-winning livestock, Hoggenberg goats. She also sat on the board of the Illinois Milk Goat Association. Milk from the Spinney Run cows, as well as supplementary milk from other local farmers when demand required it, was processed in a bottling plant on the property. Spinney Run cow and goat's milk products were delivered to the door, as well as sold at stores throughout the area. Libertyville residents could place orders at the Decker Drug Store, which is located where Edie Boutique is today. And one time, the dairy delivered the actual cow. So in the early 20th century, there were waves of milk strikes. Farmers protested that they were not being paid a fair price for their milk. They picketed bottling plants to impede milk deliveries and sometimes dumped milk from trucks and trains. One such strike occurred in May 1940. During this strike, a Winnetka woman complained that she was not receiving her Spinney Run deliveries. The dairy explained that they were being picketed and couldn't send a driver through the picket lines. According to the Chicago Daily News, the woman responded, "Then I think you ought to send me a cow." So they did. The woman was surprised but took it in stride and had the cow chained up in the kennel that used to house her Great Dane. The dairy sent someone to feed and milk the cow. The cow was able to provide milk for the entire neighborhood during her several-day stay in Winnetka before heading home when the strike was over. So recently, the Libertyville Historical Society received a donation of a few photos of Spinney Run. The donor found them in his mother's photo collection, but couldn't tell us why she had found them. Well, when researching the program, I happened upon this news blurb. George Schellenberger is now employed at the Spinney Run farm. Well, George Schellenberger was the donor's uncle, and he went on to be a dairy cow breeder for the rest of his life. Arthur Farwell passed away in 1957. His son, Ralph Isham Farwell, and then his grandson, Cameron Waterman Farwell Sr., ran the dairy for many more years. The family began selling parcels of the dairy property around 1970. And in 1973, the village of Gurnee annexed a little over 380 acres of the farm, which allowed development to proceed with a multi-year plan to construct housing and a 9-hole golf course. Development was originally intended to become called Spinney Run, but the dairy had trademarked the name, so Heather Ridge was selected instead. But Spinney Run Drive and the nearby Spinney Run Shopping Plaza are modern-day hints to the property's past. The dairy went out of business about 1980, but the Farwell family still owned the land immediately surrounding the house for many years. John V. Farwell IV lived in the Spinney Run home until he moved to Oregon. The home was torn down in 2012. But it wasn't only those that could afford large pieces of land that moved between the two towns. Those that worked on the estates also transitioned between the two locales. One of the drivers of the gentleman farm movement was the arrival of immigrants, largely from Western or Central Europe, who provided an inexpensive labor force, as well as one with expertise working on estates or gardens, sometimes derived from jobs they held in their homelands. And our next two families fit that description. One family immigrated to Lake Forest and later moved to Libertyville. The other family settled first in Libertyville and then lived in Lake Forest. Henry C., seen here in the center, and Prudence Williams Burridge immigrated from England to Canada in 1886, shortly after their wedding. One of their brothers owned a farm in Darlington Township, Ontario, near Lake Erie. Children George, Urban, and Madeline, also known as Olive, were born there. The couple farmed there for about a decade. In 1895, Henry's brother Sidney convinced him to move to Lake Forest, Illinois, where Sidney had lived for some years. Family stories say that in England, Henry had learned the art of growing plants while working on the estate of Lord Salisbury. Sidney found Henry a job as a gardener on one of the Lake Forest estates. According to Henry's oldest son, George, this first job was on the estate of Lewis F. Swift of the meatpacking family. By the end of 1895, Henry had saved enough money to bring the rest of the family to join him. By the 1900 census, Henry was working on the John Dwight estate in Lake Forest, which is on Lake Avenue, bordering Lake Michigan. The Burridge family thrived in Lake Forest. H.C. was a founder of the Church of the Holy Spirit Episcopal Church, and reportedly his son John, born in Lake Forest in 1902, was the second baby baptized there. Sidney went on to own a pool hall and a cigar shop in Lake Forest in the 1920s, located on the north side of Market Square. Sidney's daughter Margaret married into the Kittle family, who owned Kittle's, a hardware store and bicycle shop on Market Square, located right next door to Burridge's. The Kittle's remains in Lake Forest to this day, now as a sporting goods store. And Margaret's 2004 obituary called her a liberated woman for her times. She was among the first women in her town to bob her hair and to have a driver's license. She worked as an executive secretary at a Lake Forest bank and served as bookkeeper for the Kittles Bicycle and Hardware store. So in 1906, Henry purchased a number of acres from the Diamond family, which was a little over a mile west of downtown Libertyville. 2 years later, he established Fairholme Gardens and built a brick family home on the property. The property is shown here in a 1946 aerial photograph. Son George stayed in Lake Forest and worked on the Alfred Granger estate. Granger was an architect who designed many Chicago area train stations. In Lake Forest, George Burwood met local teacher Jeannie Shaw. Jeannie was born in Glasgow, Scotland in 1888. She was raised in Lowell, Massachusetts, and came to Lake Forest in 1909 to teach school. The couple dated for many years, and after George's World War I service, the couple married in 1921. When George joined his father in the Libertyville business in 1912 as a junior partner, the firm also became known as H.C. Burridge and Son. Customers included the Armours, the Folds, and the Lehmans near Lake Villa. As in Lake Forest, in Libertyville, the Burridge family played a part in the establishment of the Episcopal Church. Regular Episcopalian services started in a second-story lodge hall on Milwaukee Avenue in 1908. In 1910, residents made an application to form the St. Lawrence Mission. A granddaughter of H.C. wrote that it was the Burridges that chose the name St. Lawrence. H.C. Burridge was on the first finance committee. His daughter Olive was a Sunday school teacher. Son John was an acolyte, and they all sang in the choir. The congregation first rented and then purchased the Union Church building, seen here on the left. That building was destroyed by a fire in early January 1917, and the St. Lawrence congregation rebuilt on the same spot and celebrated the 100th anniversary of the new building in 2017. The Burridge family ran Fairholme Gardens for 92 years and through 3 generations. When Henry passed away in 1922, George took over. John continued to work at the nursery until 1947, when he moved his young family to Oregon and started a nursery there. George passed the business to his son, George. After the passing of the younger George in 1999, the family started to consider selling the remaining land. The property was sold to High School District 128 in 2000 and is now athletic fields, but Burridge Court stands as a reminder of the family.
Our next Libertyville Lake Forest family emigrated from Scotland. The Brebner family historically was from a Weaver clan that had been engaged in farming for generations. To give you a sense of where they came from, pictured are some views of the farm and village where the Brebners were tenants in the Scottish Highlands. Alexander Brebner married the daughter of a neighbor, Mary Simpson, called Polly, in 1907. You can see them surrounded by friends and family members in this photograph here. The wedding was also a sending off party. Just days later, Alexander and Polly set off for the United States. Soon they would end up in Lake County, Illinois. The couple joined a wave of migrating Scots from Aberdeenshire to our neck of the woods, having heard tell of neighbors and cousins who made the most of opportunities employing their expertise in farming, building, and gardening trades. Like Polly's brother, Arthur Simpson, who'd emigrated and found work at a farm in Vernon Township the year before. Establishing himself in his new country, Alexander Brebner drew upon his many years of experience farming back in the Highlands of Scotland to secure a job overseeing an estate at Rodney Farm in Libertyville, owned by Rodney B. Swift. You can see where the farm was located on this 1907 map, west of Butterfield Road and about where the Pine Meadow Golf Course is today. Rodney B. Swift, the owner of the estate, was the general counsel for International Harvester Company for many years, which was headed by Lake Forester Cyrus McCormick Jr. Swift was also part of the Gentleman Farm Movement. In 1906, he purchased this land in Libertyville Township, though like many, he maintained a Chicago residence as well. He would hire the newly emigrated Alexander Brebner to help run the dairy farm just a couple years later. In 1916, Swift was elected to the first of 2 4-year terms as an Illinois state senator from this district. In that same year, Swift led one of the early milk strikes as president of the Milk Producers Association. As a result of the action, farmers were granted the privilege of setting the price of their own product for the first time. The Brudners lived and worked on Rodney Farms for several years in the 19 teens. They found the area agreeable enough to send good reviews to the folks back home. Eventually, 6 of Polly Brudner's 8 Simpson siblings would make their way across the pond from Scotland, with 4 settling close to the Brudners in Lake County. This went a long way to creating a sense of community in a new and very different place. Just under a year after arriving in the US, Alexander and Polly's first child, Alexander Simpson Brudner, was born. He was often called Sandy to avoid confusion with his father. After spending his early childhood in Libertyville, Sandy Brudner would go on to serve in the Lake Forest Police Department for over 30 years, including nearly a decade as the chief of police, retiring in the 1960s. By 1917, Alexander Brudner got a new job in Lake Forest, and the family moved to a new home. Brudner was hired to serve as superintendent of the farm and estate at Pembroke Lodge in Lake Forest, owned by David Benton Jones. As you can see from the map, the estate was located on the southwest corner of Deer Path and Green Bay Road, extending all the way toward the Skokie River. One of the magnificent westward views from the balcony is pictured here on the right. David B. Jones was the chairman of Mineral Point Zinc Company and considered one of the founders of that industry in the US. His daughter Catherine was married to the planner and architect Edward Bennett, who had partnered with Daniel Burnham on the plan of Chicago. Catherine and Edward lived across the street from Jones. For nearly a decade, the Brudner family resided on the Jones estate until they'd saved up enough to purchase their own home in town. Various Simpson relatives would join them in working for Jones at Pembroke Lodge or for the Bennetts across the street.
Our next category is architects. We have one architect that lived in Libertyville but designed large houses throughout the North Shore and around the country, and another architect with deep roots in Lake Forest who designed several buildings in Libertyville. David Adler's name resounds through Libertyville history to this day, with multiple institutions on the north side of our community serving as namesakes. Adler was born in 1882 in Milwaukee, the son of Therese Hyman Adler and Isaac David Adler, a successful wholesale maker of men's clothing. David had one sister, Frances Adler Elkins, who became a noted 20th century interior decorator and often collaborated with her brother on various projects. David attended public schools in Milwaukee until age 16, when he left to attend prep school in Lawrenceville, New Jersey. He then attended Princeton University, graduated in 1904. After graduation, he traveled and studied widely in Europe, including architectural studies in Berlin and the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. While in Europe, Adler met Henry Dangler, who would later become his business partner. In 1911, Adler and Dangler both returned from Europe and went to work for the famous Chicago architect Howard Van Doren Shaw, a resident of Lake Forest, whose home on Green Bay Road, Ragdale, is now an artist colony. It was Henry Dangler who introduced the young architect to his future wife, Catherine Keefe. Catherine was a writer and excellent horsewoman. The couple married in 1916 and lived at 1240 North State Parkway in Chicago. In 1917, David and Catherine purchased a large parcel of land north of downtown Libertyville, which included the Civil War era house seen here. Given his profession, it comes as no surprise that Adler continually made changes to his own property. And you can see that this is what it looked like in probably the mid-40s or before his death. Over the years, he so extensively modified and added onto the old farmhouse that it makes it nearly impossible to believe that the farmhouse is still in there, but it is. Catherine Adler died in 1930 in a car accident in Europe. At that time, David Adler gave up his Chicago townhouse and moved permanently to his Libertyville home. When Adler died in 1949, his sister Frances served as executor. The Adlers had no children, so Miss Elkins donated the house and the 240-acre estate to the village of Libertyville. Visual artists began to use the house for exhibits, classes, and meetings, founding the Libertyville Art Center in 1957. In 1975, the Libertyville School of Folk and Old-Time Music began sharing the house, and instituted a regular weekly open stage jam session with a series of folk music classes as well. Under the guidance of Lake Bluff resident William McCormick Blair, President Emeritus of the Art Institute of Chicago and longtime friend of Adler, the David Adler Cultural Center was founded in 1980. Other parts of David Adler's property became Adler Memorial Park. Adler School, which opened in 1959, is also named for the prominent architect.
Tracking back to Adler's early career, after some time in Howard Van Doren Shaw's office, David Adler and Henry Dangler opened their own firm in the 1910s. Because Adler was not an officially licensed architect in Illinois, he failed the exam in 1917, Dangler had to sign off on all their jobs, regardless of who was actually the lead architect. After Dangler's death, later partner Robert Work did the same thing, though in 1928, with over 30 commissions to his name, the state licensing board granted Adler an honorary license, and from then on, he practiced on his own. Adler was best known as an architect of country houses. He designed 45 in all across 15 different states, although the majority are on the North Shore of Chicago. Lake Forest is home to several. Adler is recognized for his eclecticism in country house design. The choice of style reference, be it French, Tudor, Italianate, classical, colonial revival, was less important than beauty and unity of expression. His incorporation of a variety of style influences can be seen in two commissions for William Ellsworth Cloud Jr., undertaken 15 years apart. On the left is the first home by the firm of Adler and Dangler in 1913, a later Georgian-inspired residence on Green Bay Road. On the right, the second Clow House, around the corner on Ridge Lane, by the firm of Adler and Work in 1928, is characterized by French Art Deco design, with a simplified classic facade and spare forecourt. In 1931, Adler was at the height of his powers and undertook two spectacular lakefront commissions, one in Lake Bluff, the other in Lake Forest. Here, Adler drew on colonial and federal styles to design this Lake Bluff estate for Lester and Leola Armour. Lester was one of several heirs of the Armour Meatpacking Company in Lake Forest, Lake Bluff. This home was a partnership between Adler and his sister Frances Elkins, who both traveled to Europe with Leola Armour to choose furnishings and decorative elements for this 46-room estate. This home was more recently known as the setting for the 1977 Robert Altman film, A Wedding. David Adler used shimmering gray Pennsylvania mica stone for this Georgian revival estate built for Helen Shedd Reed, one of the daughters of John G. Shedd of Shedd Aquarium. The 30-room, 14-bedroom residence, situated on a bluff overlooking Lake Michigan, was another partnership between Adler and his sister. It features 12 fireplaces, 10 bathrooms, Hermes leather-covered library walls, and a parquet flooring from a chateau belonging to the mistress of Louis XV. Yes. So, overlapping in the 1900s with Adler was another architect, Stanley Anderson, who was one of the most prolific designers in Lake Forest history, and who also had several commissions in Libertyville. So Anderson had deep roots in the Lake Forest community. His grandfather, James Anderson, had settled in Lake Forest way back in 1858, before the city had even been incorporated. James Anderson established a store which sold general merchandise and dry goods, and was located at the corner of Deer Path and McKinley, opposite the train station. Here you can see an 1800s view of his store, and then on the upper right, the building that replaced it in 1904, still called the Anderson Block, and which also housed the store for many years, before it was occupied by Walgreens, which remains there to this day. Stanley Anderson, James Anderson's grandson, was born in Lake Forest in 1895. He attended Lake Forest College and the University of Illinois Architectural School before finishing his education at the École des Beaux-Arts. Like Adler, he joined Howard Van Doren Shaw's office in 1919 and was soon taking on outside jobs, some through his family connections. Stanley Anderson went on to partner with James Ticknor, forming Anderson and Ticknor following Shaw's death in 1926. Stanley Anderson did the majority of his work at the end of the estate era. He is known for his country Georgian style, often evident in the 30-plus public and commercial buildings he designed, as well as the nearly 200 fine residences and numerous renovations and additions to local estate houses. One of his best-known commissions locally is his 1935 design for Lake Forest High School, with a facade more closely resembling a country house than what was typical in public school architecture at the time, or at any time. Similarly inspired was Anderson's design for Lake Forest Hospital in 1942, which took some design cues from the estate of the Albert Blake Dick family, which had donated much of the land for the new hospital, which has only recently been demolished. In 1925, Anderson and Ticknor designed a new business block in downtown Lake Bluff for local realtor John Griffith, which originally housed 4 storefronts as well as upstairs apartments. The architecture features many colonial revival elements in the windows, cornices, and lintels, as well as in the door surrounds. Bluffington's Cafe and Lawrence Framing are located there today.
The architectural themes of the Lake Bluff building are echoed in Libertyville's Bartholomew building. Frank H. Bartholomew purchased the Libertyville property with 112 feet of frontage on Milwaukee Avenue and 180 feet on Broadway from the Kennedy brothers in early 1929, and commissioned Lake Forest architects Anderson and Ticknor to design a structure with 6 storefronts on the first level and kitchenette apartments above. This sketch from the Anderson Ticknor Company archives shows the fine details of the Milwaukee Avenue doorway. And here you can also really see how similar it is to that Lake Forest or Lake Bluff building. Bartholomew was a notable resident of Lake Forest. His home was at the former estate of Charles Garfield King. King's daughter, Minerva, was the first love of author F. Scott Fitzgerald and the inspiration for the character Daisy Buchanan in his novel The Great Gatsby. One more shameless plug. If you're interested in learning more about F. Scott Fitzgerald and Lake Forest, we encourage you to visit the current exhibit at the History Center of Lake Forest, Lake Bluff, which is in commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the publishing of The Great Gatsby. The exhibition delves into the Roaring Twenties era Fitzgerald depicted, the Lake Forest he experienced, and the real individuals who inspired the characters in The Great Gatsby and his other stories. Anderson and Ticknor also designed the new Central School building built on School Street next door to the original 1886 building. This rendering from the Anderson and Ticknor archive was drawn in order to sell the building to the school district, so you'll note that the completed building has the wing on the opposite side from the architectural rendering. Construction of the school was partially financed by a Public Works Administration grant. The new building opened to students in the fall of 1939. And the former Central School was demolished to make way for a new playground. Another of Anderson's Libertyville commissions helps us make yet another Lake Forest and Libertyville connection. Lake Forest resident and Mayor Elliott Donnelly, grandson of Chicago printer R.R. Donnelly, had a passion for model trains. He used some of the money from his printing inheritance to go into the model railroading business in 1933. He acquired American Model Engineers, Inc., which he rebranded as Scalecraft Scale Models, Inc. Right away, the new company scored a coup, with several of its sets on display before thousands in the railroad exhibit at the Century of Progress World's Fair. The trains Scalecraft produced were not marketed as toys. The company targeted its product towards adult hobbyists, creating scale model kits with a high level of detail and realism. Originally, Scalecraft operated in Chicago, but in 1940, Donnelly moved at least some of his production to Libertyville. First operating in one of the old American wire fence buildings at the end of Church Street, in the late 1940s, the company constructed a new factory off West Lake Street, which later became home to Trim Incorporated. During World War II, Donnelly converted his plant to manufacture parts for military use and commissioned Stanley Anderson to design and build some small houses for government officials supervising the work. Several of these houses still stand on Coolidge Avenue. Now, Donnelly wasn't the only business person with connections in both towns. Next, we'll discuss 2 families whose impact on local commerce extended across the generations.
After first settling in Diamond Lake with his family as a young boy, Curtis Gideon Wenban established himself in business in Lake Forest in the 1870s, running a livery stable located on Deer Path. At the same time, in a small town like Lake Forest was then, the livery sometimes doubled as the undertaker, given that they had the equipment to transport a coffin. And this was the case with Wenban. Little did they know that it would be this aspect of their business that would propel their family name into 21st century Lake Forest. In 1909, Curtis Wenban's son George started the first Buick agency in Lake County. You see how far we've come in less than a decade from the shock at Arthur Farwell's automobile. So this company became C.G. Wenban and Son, and as you can see from the advertisement, for a time offered carriages and livery, Buick motor cars, and undertaking services, all out of the storefront on Deer Path pictured here. This building is no longer standing. You can see what it looked like in the 1950s on the left. An annex had been built to house the Buick dealership at right. In 1986, it was all torn down to make way for a new business block. The funeral home, the most lasting part of the business, moved around the corner to Western Avenue, where it remains to this day. Another of Curtis Wenban's sons, Frank J. Wenban, decided to go into the business of prolonging people's lives before his father and brother buried them. A graduate of Lake Forest Academy, he worked for Dr. French's pharmacy in Lake Forest from 1902 until 1914, and then opened his own drugstore down the street from the Wenban livery on Deer Path. Wenban operated that store until 1922, when he partnered with Willis W. Griffiths to buy out Dr. French's business in Market Square and start the Wenban Griffiths drugstore. The collaboration ended in 1939 when Wenban sold his interest to Griffiths.
Not ready to hang up his pharmacist jacket quite yet, in March 1940, Frank J. Wenban purchased the Lovell drugstore in Libertyville for a reported $7,000, which is about $159,000 today. Mr. Wenban kept the W.B. Lovell's name throughout his ownership. In the late 1940s, pharmacist Louis J. Petronic bought the business and eventually changed the name from Lovell's to Petronic's. Mr. Wenban and his wife, Anna Louise, lived at 428 Cook Street. They were married 71 years before Mrs. Wenban's death in June 1975. Mr. Wenban passed away just 4 months later at the age of 100.
Our last profile looks at another Old Lake Forest family with a business interest in Libertyville. Irish immigrant Michael Yore, his wife Rosanna, and their 12 children played an important role in shaping West Lake Forest. They settled on a 160-acre farm in the early 1840s, and Michael Yore quickly became a leader of the fledgling community, with his home serving as a gathering place. The large Yore cabin was located conveniently west of the first road through the area, now Waukegan Road. You can see the Yore name on the map here. The Yores often hosted travelers for the night, and on Sundays they entertained both the itinerant priest and churchgoers who came from miles away to attend Mass. This parish became St. Patrick's, one of the first churches in the area. Though some descendants chose to seek their fortune in California and elsewhere, more than half of Michael Yore's 12 children stayed in and around Lake Forest. This image from an 1885 Lake County atlas shows his son Thomas Yore's farm, located near the present-day intersection of Riverwoods Road and Route 60. Some combination of Michael's descendants founded Yore Brothers Dairy Company in Chicago around 1888. Late 1880s Chicago city directories show Michael's sons Lawrence Yore and Thomas Yore were in the milk business on South May Street. The obituaries of Thomas and Rose Yore, children of Michael's son George, indicate that they were also involved in the founding of the company. Their brothers Edward and Joseph also worked in the family business. It's likely more of the family was involved. The Yores had a lot of kids and reused family first names, so it can be difficult to determine who was who, but they were all involved in the success of the dairy.
About 1905, Yore Brothers established a bottling plant in Libertyville. The building seen here was located on the south side of the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad tracks west of Milwaukee Avenue. A 1908 Lake County Independent article reported that more than 40 farmers delivered milk each morning to the bottling plant, and each evening a carload of milk was shipped to Chicago. At the time, the Yor Brothers plant bottled about 1,500 gallons of milk every day. By 1923, the amount of milk received from local farmers exceeded the capacity of the Libertyville plant. The Yor Brothers moved their pasteurizing and bottling department to a brand new factory in Chicago on Western Avenue. The plant stood empty for many years. In January 1931, the empty factory building, which had recently been sold to a Mundelein man who planned to harvest the lumber, burned to the ground. So we were aware of the Yor Brothers dairy when I came across another possible Libertyville connection for the Yor family when I was preparing for this presentation. In 1885, the Waukegan Weekly Gazette reported on a fire at a sawmill belonging to Thomas Yor of Libertyville, which we're pretty sure is the Thomas Yor that we've been discussing, and that Liberty was just considered to be the nearest town to the Yor farm. So when planning this presentation, we set out to profile 2 people or families in 4 categories. But along the way, we've made additional connections, such as Libertyville buildings commissioned by Lake Forest resident Frank Bartholomew and Elliott Donnelly's Scalecraft Company. And we didn't even have time to look at other known connections, such as the Kennedy and Bradley families, which both have roads named after them on the border of the 2 towns. And we're sure there's also so many more individuals that have connections, such as Ole Ekstrom, who grew up in Lake Forest before his family moved to Libertyville, just ahead of his sophomore year in high school. His dad had been the gardener for Glen Rowan House on the campus of Lake Forest College. After Ole's graduation from Libertyville High School, the family returned to Lake Forest. Ole enlisted in the Marine Corps in July 1942. Corporal Ekstrom was killed in the Battle of Okinawa. He's remembered by both towns, on the Libertyville Veterans Memorial at Libertyville's Lakeside Cemetery, and on the Veterans Memorial Park Hero List at the Lake Forest American Legion Post. So if you know of other Libertyville Lake Forest connections, we would love to hear from you. You can contact Laurie or myself at the emails on this slide. And we thank you very much for your attention, and we're happy to take questions at this time.